Okay, folks, here we are in the next mini lecture about plant herbivore interactions. And this is really my bread and butter. A lot of pollinators are plant herbivores, for example, right? A lot of pollinators are plant herbivores. For example, bees eat pollen and nectar. The Graya moths I told you about eat ovules and seeds of plants. But also all sorts of animals eat leaves, right? All sorts of herbivores eat stems. And we've talked about how plant herbivore interactions tend to be a little bit more specialized than carnivore interactions, right? Where a species might specialize on a given tissue or on a given resource, right? And plant herbivore interactions, like carnivory interactions, have suites of traits that help us sort of understand and make predictive hypotheses about adaptation and ecological processes, right? And so we talked about sort of like sit and wait versus active hunting predators. Something is very different about plant herbivore interactions that shapes the outcome of these interactions, and that is that plants are stationary, right? So they aren't prone to sit and wait predators because they aren't going to walk up on a sit and wait predator, right? There can't be sit and wait herbivores. I mean, there could be. I could imagine an herbivore that let pollen blow into its mouth or something, but that's not very common, not one that I even know of. Instead, the encounter rate in plant herbivore interactions is very high. There's lots of plants out on the landscape, and herbivores are walking around and eating them. It's not like the plants are running away. And the nature of this interaction, the nature of this high encounter rate drives specialization, like we were talking about early on in the lecture, but also shapes the traits that plants evolve to minimize consumption of this positive-negative interaction, right? And so plants can do a couple of classes of things to minimize their loss to herbivory. The first thing they can do is avoid it, right? So they can just avoid being eaten. The best case of this is mast seeding plants, M-A-S-T, mast seeding. And this is like the periodic cicada version of plants making seeds, right? So cicadas do this thing where they all synchronously come out of the ground, and then there's too many for anything to eat all of them, and so many of them survive. The per capita death rate goes way down. Plants actually do this all the time. So I'm giving you a special example for animals, but mast seeding trees especially do this same strategy, where certain physiological traits triggered by the year or triggered by any number of abiotic factors make it such that a population of a given species all have really high abundant reproduction in a given year. And because of this, the per capita rate of consumption goes down per seed, right? Many of the seeds escape because no single herbivore, none of the herbivores in the landscape can eat them all. So that's the first thing plants can do, is they can avoid being eaten. The second thing plants can do is they can tolerate being eaten, right? So you can't run away. Maybe you can't mass seed because you're not in a big enough population or something like that. You can just tolerate being eaten. You can minimize the negative impact on your fitness, right? You can make it such that when you get eaten, you are less likely to die from this plant-herbivore interaction, right? One of my favorite cases of this are in plants in the family Poaceae. These are grasses. And they have meristems. These are the specialized tissues in plants that allow them to grow. They have meristems in between their roots and shoots, right? Many plants only have apical meristems, meaning just at the tip of the branches do they grow. If you go out in the early spring in the Northeast, you'll see this, right? That most of the tree's branches aren't growing from the middle. They grow from the tip, from the apical meristem. Poaceae, grasses on the other hand, have this meristem between the root and the shoot that we think is an adaptation to herbivory, right? That if a big grazing herbivore comes along and chomps off all of your grass blades, you can still grow from that meristem that is located between your roots and shoots. So you can tolerate consumption in that way. Other plants have all sorts of other adaptations that help them tolerate consumption, but this tolerance, we should say, is largely dependent on physiological state. Right? So that, for example, when there's a drought, you don't go out and cut your grass because that grass is already stressed, and all of the energy it would take to then regrow those shoots could kill the plants, right? And so plants that are highly stressed because of abiotic interactions or because of previous negative interactions with herbivores may have a lower tolerance for herbivory than sort of other conspecifics who aren't under stress. Okay, The next one that I like, so we have avoidance, we have tolerance, and then we have defenses. These are my favorite. This is a lot of what I studied in my dissertation and part of my postdoc, right? And defenses are these active traits of plants that minimize herbivory, that don't avoid it, that don't tolerate it, but actively deter herbivores from consuming plants. And these can be brought into all different categories. We have physical defenses. You guys should be abundantly aware of these. These are thorns, prickles, etc. Even hairs, right? If you do you know mullein? This is a common roadside herb. It has tons of hairs on its leaves that make it really difficult to eat, right? Some plants that I'm sure you've seen in your ecology and action assignments are things like smilax, catbrier. Smilax bonanox is probably the one you've seen, or auriculata. These have recurvate thorns, right? That if you go running through the smilax, you're going to get cut into pieces, and if you're trying to chomp on it, it's going to stab you in the mouth, right? You've also, a lot of you have seen opuntia. These are prickly pears, classic cases of physical thorns for defense, right? Another kind of defenses, some of my favorite ones, are chemical. And plants are astounding organic chemists. All of the organic chemistry that we do, or almost all of it, you should talk to an organic chemist to say if it's all, but almost all of the organic chemistry we do is inspired by plants, right? Plants make all sorts of different kinds of toxins, things like alkaloids that are actively toxic that'll kill you. They make things that make them less digestible, things like tannins. So if you are old enough to drink, you can drink your wine and taste the tannins in your wine because it leaves a slight numbness on your tongue, right? The tannins in your coffee. These make your gut work less efficiently as an herbivore and make you less palatable to consumers, right? So these are all kinds of chemical defenses. And then the last one is they can co-opt bodyguards. This is one of my favorites. And so I'm sure you guys have seen this lately. The most common plants around here that do this are things like a couple different fabaceous plants in the bean family, but they actively recruit bodyguards like ants, right? By producing either places for those ants to live or producing all kinds of sugar outside of their flowers for those ants to eat. And great cases of this are large acacia trees in Africa that make domatia. These are large thorns that have holes in them that the ants can live in. And the thorns don't stop elephants from eating the trees. But if you go and shake the tree, a bunch of like intense biting ants come out, and those do stop elephants from eating the trees, right? Okay, so plants can either avoid herbivory, tolerate herbivory, or defend themselves. They can defend themselves via a bunch of different mechanisms: physical defenses, chemical defenses, sort of mutualistic interactions with other species that act as defenses, right? And herbivores, on the other hand, have a bunch of strategies to maximize their consumption, right? To maximize their consumption. And so there's lots of ones covered in your chapter. I'm not going to go through every one that's covered, but I'm going to give you examples of adaptations of herbivores that help them eat each of these plants I just told you about. So the first one for these mass-seeding plants, the coolest example of an herbivore adaptation to eat these is seed-caching birds. So one of my favorite friends from my graduate school days studied seed-caching chickadees in the Sierra Nevada mountains. And these chickadees have astoundingly good spatial memory because when the pine trees up there do their massed seeding, they all seed at the same time. The chickadees can't possibly consume all the seeds, but what they can do is carry them off and hide them somewhere in a tree. They can stick them up under bark, right? And chickadees have evolved at high elevations in really harsh winters extremely good memories for where they hide these seeds. And this lets them take advantage of this massed seeding crop, right? So these are sort of seed caching birds. Some of that work from my friend showed also that natural selection at high elevations, where really harsh winters are, actually select for smarter birds, and then lower elevations, birds are more aggressive. The being smart doesn't matter as much because you don't need to cache as many seeds, and rather being aggressive and big is better for male birds there, which is kind of a neat pattern. So this is mountain chickadees. Poaceae, the herbivores that eat these have evolved all sorts of crazy adaptations to handle them being largely not very digestible, right? Poaceae isn't this really nitrogen-rich crop, and one of the things that's key in plant-herbivore interactions is the amount of nitrogen, right? So animals, we're full of nitrogen, we're full of protein, we're full of all of these amino acids that have nitrogen in them. Plants have far fewer, far lower amounts of protein than animal flesh in general. Don't get mad at me if you're a vegetarian, but in general, less nitrogen in plants than animals, right? And in Poaceae, because of these interstitial meristems, they invest even less, not just because of it, but one of the things they do is they invest even less nitrogen in those above ground parts. And so we have all kinds of crazy adaptations in grazing herbivores, in ruminants, for example, that have whole sets of crazy stomachs where they co-opt bacteria to help them digest and redigest these relatively low quality foods that still allows them to persist on the landscape and to eat this. So we can say ruminants. And this is like wild. For you guys, this is supposed to be a cow. Cow and all of its rumens. Right, there's a cow and its udder, tail. And they have all sorts of chambers in their guts that help them sort of digest this low quality food. The last one are defenses, right? Are defenses, and animals have evolved all kinds of crazy adaptations, especially to things like these chemical defenses. The best example is one I've already covered, or one of the best understood examples of plant herbivore chemical coevolution is monarch caterpillars and their host plants that they grow up eating, which are milkweeds, right? These milkweeds have cardiac glycosides, cardenolides. These are compounds that literally, given the name, are cardiac arresters, right? They are very toxic. And yet, monarchs have evolved the biosynthetic pathways to digest, and actually not digest, but sequester and eat these compounds and keep them in their body. And they actually co-opt these toxic compounds to defend themselves from carnivores, right? So we have sequestration or digestion. Some animals just digest the toxic compounds that plants make, for example, right? Okay. The last thing I want to talk about is a case study here. And this is the idea of escape and radiate coevolution. And this is a really foundational idea in plant-herbivore interactions, plant-herbivore coevolution. And one of the papers that described this really early on, it's not the only folks that talked about it, but one that's commonly cited, is this paper from Paul Ehrlich and Peter Raven. If you take a botany class, Peter Raven probably wrote the textbook, right? And these two guys in the 60s wrote a paper called Butterflies and Plants, a Study in Coevolution. And one of the questions they were interested in is, why are there so many dang species of butterflies? Why are there so many dang species of butterflies? And they posited this coevolutionary arms race as one of the ways or one of the mechanisms that leads to this diversity. So you can imagine a situation, let's draw a little picture here, where we have a plant in green, and an herbivore that eats it. We'll draw that in, red, right? Here's our little caterpillar that eats it, right? And some of these plants have a defensive compound, right? Some of these plants have a defensive compound that makes the herbivores less fit, right? That is part of what we've talked about as one of the strategies that plants might evolve to minimize herbivore damage, right? Makes those herbivores less fit. And what happens maybe is via a suite of all of the things that generate biodiversity, so mutation, that's the main one that generates biodiversity in this case, they actually evolve a novel compound that makes them totally unpalatable to the herbivore, right? So in this situation, we would then have a situation where, okay, our original lineage is still being eaten by our friendly caterpillar in red, right? Let's draw it in red here. But then an alternate lineage has evolved a different set of compounds that lets it escape from that herbivory, right? So here, let's actually just make it a different color, right? A different set of compounds that help it escape from that herbivory, this yellow plant, right? And because of this escape, it then goes crazy in terms of its biomass, and that gives it lots of the raw material, right? Because mutations are rare, to start evolving all sorts of crazy defenses, right? So then we have some proliferation of defenses in this population of the escaped plant, where some plants make compound A, some plants make compound B, some plants make compound C. But of course, in this situation that we've just described, now we have a bunch of caterpillars competing for this single plant species that may or may not be that abundant, and there are a ton of open niches over here along the top that are not being consumed, right? There's a bunch of resources that are not being eaten, and so then simultaneously coevolution might happen, right? Where butterflies first evolve to eat that escaped species, and then evolve specialized metabolic pathways to eat each of these daughter species. And then you could imagine that some of these lineages would die off, but then some of these plants would then escape again. That evolution would favor chemistry that helps them avoid herbivory, and that will allow them to diversify. That would give them the biomass they need for lots of mutations to happen. And then along those same lines, the herbivore would co-speciate, or in this case, evolve to eat those plants. If this then resulted in species separation, so reproductive barriers between each of these species of caterpillars, then we'd have co-speciation, if there were reproductive barriers between the plants and reproductive barriers between the herbivores. And this is what we would call escape and radiate coevolution, right? Escape and radiate coevolution, where the plant evolves a new defense, it allows it to take open a whole new niche space, and then the consumers co-evolve along with it. And then another escape and radiation, and another escape and radiation. This idea is really cloying and cool. It's a neat theory. There's been some evidence that supports it, but this escape and radiate hypothesis is one of the key ideas, or one of the key theories that we think might describe why diversity is so high in these plant herbivore systems, especially in the tropics, and why specialization is so high, right? So you can imagine a situation now where these moths or butterflies or whatever that have evolved all of the biosynthetic machinery to digest this crazy compound. I guess it should have 6 sides, but imagine this is some crazy compound with H's and O's, and maybe it's an alkaloid with an N, and that's in a ring, that they no longer have the biosynthetic machinery to digest the previous host, right? That there's trade-offs, that they're inherent in radiating, you lose the ability to go backwards. This is one of the theories that we have for why that diversity is so high. So that's the thing I want you guys to know. Escape and radiate, Ehrlich and Raven, butterflies, and plants. Awesome. Thanks, folks.